pronouns are
Recording in progress.
My pronouns are she and her, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Universalist Unitarian community of Halifax. We are very happy that we have a new minister, Reverend Ben Robbins. Ben, in common with most UU ministers, has one Sunday off service duty monthly. And today's service is being brought to you by our Reconciliation and Dismantling Racism Committee, Brian Gifford, Scott Wood, Amy Moonshadow, Irene Barros-Johnson, Margaret Galbraith, and myself. And Irene actually wrote the reflections today, which are going to be read to you by different members of the committee. We are people of many paths who are brave, curious, and compassionate thinkers and doers. We are diverse in faith, ethnicity, history, and spirituality, but are aligned in our desire to make a difference for the good. We have radical roots and history as a self-motivated spiritual people. We think for ourselves, and we recognize that life experience is the strongest influence on our beliefs. If you are new here, we welcome you. And if we haven't seen you for a while, welcome back. If you are new or feeling new, please introduce yourself to us after. After the service, there will be coffee and hot chocolate provided by Pam Berman. I wrote that in the script, Pam, if she's here. It's wrong in the order of service. If you would like to be on our email distribution list, please leave your name and email address in the book just back there in the ballroom. And I draw your attention to the announcements in the order of service. After today's service at noon, I think it says, but right after the service is the humanist discussion. Is there two loaded words? Is there value in loyalty? And will that be in the sanctuary? In the sanctuary at noon. Before we go any further, though, we must acknowledge the truth of this land. Scott Wood on Zoom, Icy Side Streets, has our land acknowledgement today.
Thank you, Pam. Pelasi, welcome. We are meeting today in Mi'kmaq, the unceded ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people who lived here for millennia before European settlers arrived. With their arrival, they brought worldview, culture, and values greatly at odds with those of the indigenous people who welcomed them. Nevertheless, treaties were entered into spelling out. I'm getting feedback here. My earplug. Better. Am I getting feedback here? Am I getting feedback? Hello?
We can hear you fine, Scott.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this, but I'm getting some feedback. So I'm going to place. Maybe if I go away from the computer, I will be able to do this. I don't know why I'm getting feedback. So maybe I'll say now, with the arrival of their worldview, culture, and values greatly at odds with those of the indigenous people who will welcome them. Nevertheless, treaties were entered into spelling out how they could coexist. However, these treaties were violated by the settlers as colonization and subjugation were pursued. This was caused great injustice to our indigenous peoples and their descendants. We are all treating people and called on to seek reconciliation and live in right relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We are also called on in other related ways. One, to live in right relationship with the land's black members, communities whose members were violently abducted from their African homeland where they were enslaved in North America. Many were subsequently brought or escaped to British North America where slavery was banned. However, they still face discrimination, economic disadvantage, and racism. For example, freed slaves were given land grants, often on extremely poor land in isolated places, and without clear title to their property. We still grapple today with the consequences of racism and discrimination and the need for reconciliation with them. We are also called on to not forget that other people of color and other marginalized people also have been wounded and disadvantaged by racism and discrimination. We must also make sure that our path of reconciliation leads us to live in right relationship with them too. 3, it is essential for the survival and thriving of all the peoples of Mi'kma'ki that we live in right relationship with Mother Earth. We should listen carefully to the wisdom of our Indigenous people whose relationship with the natural world offers important guidance to us as we seek to address the climate crisis and other critical threats to our planet's environment. May we find a path forward that leads us to live in right harmony with one another and respect for Mother Earth. Walaki. Wow.
That we call worship, where we turn with intention to the things that are worthy of our attention. And we do this by lighting a chalice. Our chalice lighting this morning is by Odette Fulbright Fulson. We inherit this free faith from the brave and gentle. This light we kindle is set in the lamp of our history. We inherit this free faith from the brave and gentle, fierce and outspoken. Hearts and minds that have come before us, let us be worthy inheritors of this faith, and through our good works, pass it boldly to a new generation. Our opening hymn this morning is number 170 in the Gray Hymn Book, if you want to follow in a hymn book. But the lyrics will be up on the screen as well. And you can stand or sit or lie on the floor, whatever you want, as you are willing and able.
Singing for another.
I'm 14 years old. After spending my previous school career in a private girls' school, I've switched to public junior high for grade 9. I'm short, haha, and I'm nearsighted with glasses. Everybody is taller than me. At my old school, we chose where to sit, and I always chose to sit in the very front row, not because I was all that attentive a student, but so that I could see. I walk into my new school classroom and take a seat at the front. The teacher immediately moves me to the back row, and I complain. I'm told to take my seat and talk to him after class. He explains that he needs students that are prone to misbehavior to sit in the front rows. I explain why I need a front seat. My needs are overruled. Even so, I try to take the front seat of each new classroom, and in one instance, this resulted in me being sent to the principal. Mr. Collins explained yet again about seating and told me that I should sit back and quietly observe all of the different rules. They weren't actually written down. They were just accepted behavior, and I just needed to figure it out. Viola Desmond, a Black Nova Scotia businesswoman, was also short and wore glasses. Just like me, she liked to sit at the front row in the movies. When her car broke down in New Glasgow and she had to spend some time there getting it fixed, she went to the movies and she sat in the front. She didn't know the rules. She didn't know that in New Glasgow, in that movie theater, Black people sat in the balcony and were not permitted on the first floor. She didn't know that she had been automatically sold a cheaper balcony seat. After immediately offering to pay the difference, she was violently arrested, but her charge was defrauding the province of Nova Scotia out of the 1 cent tax difference. And it just struck me when I watched the play, that could have been me. That was what I had in common with Viola Desmond. But what I did not have in common with Viola Desmond was the ability in my time and place to not shut up and just to say whatever I want to say, to make the world work for me. And let us all every day not accept things simply because they are acceptable, even laws. Question everything. Love everybody, but always seek justice. And we'll now do our joys and sorrows, which is Margaret is going to do for us.
Now we will take time to recognize our collective and individual joys, sorrows, and complex truths. We bring our hearts into this sacred space of community, and we open them up to each other, for each other. So if you have a story, a joy, or a sorrow, or a complex truth on your heart that needs to be spoken in community, we invite you to share. I have a microphone here that we can share. We invite you to drop a stone, if you wish, into our communal well to mark your story, to remind you that you are not alone. Does anyone want to come forward to share a story, or I can bring you the mic?
My next door neighbor died this week. She was an old Newfoundlander who moved up here about 60 years ago, but she still sounded like she just got off the boat. And she lived in this house for 60 years, loved it there, loved the neighborhood, and said, "The only way I'm leaving this house is feet first. They'll have to drag me out dead." Well, she didn't die at home. She died in a senior's home, but she was surrounded by her family. But it saddened me that she couldn't die at home. I will miss her. Here's to you, Lottie.
Are there any other stories to share?
Hi, I'm Mike, and I'm happy to say that I'm living back on the peninsula. And my next door neighbor is Stephen Butler.
Well, that's great. I think Steve was here today, too. Yeah. Right, there you are, Steve. Are there any other stories? Oh.
No. My son Nicholas came to breakfast yesterday morning and enjoyed it, and that makes me happy. And our former minister, Norm Harofker, was there also, so that also makes me happy.
This was a message from Irene for those of you who couldn't see her, and she's talking about the breakfast here at UUCH. Should I put a stone in for you, Irene? And another stone for Steve and Mike. Judy?
Hi, I'm a little reluctant to share this, but my son is black, and he, in one of his high school classes, came in absolute top of the class in mathematics. And his teacher talked him out of accepting the award on the basis that the child next in line would be really upset if he didn't take it. And through the years, my son has learned that some things are just not open to him. And I heard that just the other day, and it just saddened me so much.
That deserves a really big stone, Judy. Oh, and I'll drop in another stone for those thoughts that are still within our hearts, to be shared with our community silently. And now our next hymn is number 121, We'll Build a Land. And the words will be on the screen. You can stay seated for this if you can.
This month, 2 levels of our government have proclaimed February to be African Heritage Month, and the Canadian government has proclaimed it to be Black History Month. It's surprisingly recent. Canada in 1995 and Nova Scotia in 1996. We learn history, or supposed to, in order to recognize patterns in order that we can do better in future. As Canadians, it's easy to rest on our laurels of peace, order, and good government and point to anti-Black racism as something that is American. During the discussions surrounding the 8th principle just a few years ago, UUCH did a workshop in anti-Black racism with a particular emphasis on Nova Scotia. One of the presenters, an American but a Canadian citizen for decades, was asked how the racism he experiences in the US is different from that he experiences in Canada. I think that most of us were expecting him to say something about not being afraid that someone will pull a gun here, but his response chilled me and stays with me because he said, "From where I sit, it doesn't feel any different." Some members of the Reconciliation and Dismantling Racism team recently went to the play Controlled Damage about Viola Desmond. In the aftermath of the events surrounding her arrest, some of the characters were complaining about the notoriety this was bringing to their community and expressed that of course they recognize all the prejudice in their lives in 1950s Halifax, but they just wanted to live in peace going about their business and blamed Viola for some disrest. It was also stated that fighting racism in Nova Scotia and in Canada was more difficult because most things were just custom. People knew their place. It wasn't like the US where Jim Crow laws were clear. Viola Desmond herself in the play says that at least in New York, there are signs that say white only, so she knows what she can and cannot do. This morning, the RDR team is going to bring you stories of discrimination on 19th century Cunard ships. Arian Barrows Johnson has done the extensive research into this. And besides Cunard himself, there are Halifax or UU connections to each individual in the story. For those that don't know, Samuel Cunard was born in Halifax in 1787. He was an astute businessman, and among other things, he founded the Halifax Steamboat Company in 1830, which built the first steamboat in Nova Scotia, and also the first Halifax-Dartmouth steamboat ferry. In 1840, he moved on to transatlantic steamboats, fleeing to England to avoid creditors in 1842, but recovering by 1843. Recovering is an understatement. Investing in steamboats meant that a Cunard transatlantic crossing took 2 weeks, rather than the 2 to 3 months in a sailing vessel, depending on wind and sea. And Cunard won the contract for the Royal Mail, making them the dominant transatlantic line in the 19th century. And they still exist with luxury cruise ships such as the Queen Mary. The photos in the insert in the order of service are the people in today's stories. And Brian has the first part.
Thanks, Pam. Accompanied by Quaker carpenter James Buffum, Frederick Douglass set sail for Liverpool and Boston on He set sail in Boston for Liverpool on August 16, 1845, aboard the Cunard's steamship Cambria. Since Douglass was denied cabin passage because he was black, Buffum joined him in steerage. They comforted themselves with the thought that they were being thrifty and saving money. The Hutchison family singers, a 4-part harmony group who performed at many reform meetings, were also on board, and they had cabins. The two men often walked on the promenade deck with them. Many copies of the book, The Narrative of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, were sold. The book was the reason Douglass had to leave the U.S., for it indicated that he had fled for freedom from Maryland, and however articulate in his New England abolition speech-making, he was still a fugitive slave in danger of recapture. Several passengers were interested in learning more about this passenger and asked Captain Judkins that he speak. On the final night, when Douglass told about slavery to a crowd on the quarterdeck, 2 Southern men interrupted and caused a disturbance. The captain finally had to knock one down and threatened to put them in irons if they were for their rudeness to stop. 2 years later, after Douglass's freedom had been bought by English sympathizers, he bought a ticket for a first-class passage to Boston on the Cambria in London. But in Liverpool, the Cunard clerk did not wish to honor it. After Douglas wrote a letter to the Times about this, at least 18 other British newspapers printed rebukes. After all, Douglas had been making speeches all over Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. He spoke to and was known by thousands of people. Headlines published all over Great Britain read, "A British bow to an American prejudice. England made ashamed. Pro-slavery persecution in England. Shameful violation to the rights of man. Disgraceful prejudice against a man of color. American intolerance in the port of Liverpool. Disgraceful conduct toward Frederick Douglass." Kennard himself said, "No one can regret more than I do the unpleasant circumstances surrounding Mr. Douglas's passage from Liverpool, but I can assure that nothing of the kind will again take place under steamships in which I am connected." However, any assumption that all was well and fully resolved was not borne out. Captain Judkins informed Douglas that he had to take his meals in his cabin rather than with the other first-class passengers. He could not enjoy the salon or walk on deck freely. In other words, he was confined to his cabin for the entire 16 days, though he had won the right for a black person to purchase a first-class passage on the Kennard line. After John Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry to cause a slave revolt in October 1859, the governor of Virginia pursued capture of Frederick Douglass as a conspirator, which he was not. From Philadelphia, Douglass fled to his home in Rochester, New York, and then to Canada. He went on to Clifton, New Brunswick, and then to Halifax here, where he posted a letter. So in November 1859, Frederick Douglass boarded Kennard's steamer, the Nova Scotian, here in Halifax, and arrived in Liverpool November 24th. He remained in England, making abolition speeches for about a year. Frederick Douglass returned to North America cautiously by taking a ship to Portland, Maine, trains to Montreal, across Lake Ontario, before returning to Rochester. And that's the story of Frederick Douglass and the Kennard lines. And Amy will tell you the next story.
William Wells Brown left Boston on July 18, 1849, on the Kennard steamer Canada to go to Liverpool and then a peace conference in Paris. He carried a letter of introduction to English abolitionists from a Universalist minister, Reverend Charles Spear. When the steamship stopped to recoal, he recalls walking on the streets of Halifax, Nova Scotia, deep in conversation with president of Auburn College, then one of the only schools of higher learning which admitted blacks and women as students to obtain a degree. Like Douglas, he had several copies of his narrative, as well copies of the anti-slavery harp, a collection of songs for anti-slavery meetings, to sell to interested passengers. His descriptions of life in the southern states and literature caused much amazement from Northerners and adverse comment from Southerners. One of the episodes in this book was that after escaping slavery, Brown had worked on a Lake Erie steamer in Cleveland, Ohio, and helped over 60 fugitive slaves escape to Canada. When William and Ellen Craft awaited the Cambria in Halifax, Nova Scotia, since they had missed the Europa in November 1850 after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, they had difficulty buying tickets here. They had to write to a prominent Boston Unitarian to clear the way, since the Kennard office refused to sell them tickets for passage several times. Local officials in Halifax did not seem aware that blacks, even fugitives, were customarily sold passage to England in Boston. After recovering from their steerage journey on the Cambria for a month and a half, William and Ellen Craft joined William Wells Brown for 6 months in speaking throughout Great Britain and helped revitalize the abolition movement. One of the attractions of the talk was a panorama that Brown had painted of typical sites of slavery. It was based on a panorama of the Mississippi that was being shown in Halifax when the Crafts were there. To further the education of his 2 daughters, Josephine and Clarissa, William Wells Brown put them under the care of a Universalist minister, prison reformer, and anti-capitalist punishment speaker, the Reverend Charles Spear, to bring them from Boston to England on June 25th, 1851, on the Cunard steamship America. The Cunard clerk, Lewis, refused to sell tickets for them to travel unless Reverend Spear listed the girls as servants because they were black. When they sat in the ladies' lounge aboard the steamship, a white preacher's wife objected to the captain that she did not want to associate with slaves. He dismissed her by saying the girls were just dark complexioned and had a right to be there. 10 years later, Brown worked for a group trying to recruit blacks to move and settle in Haiti. As a result, William Wells Brown wrote an interesting report on black occupations, business schools, churches, and benevolent associations in Toronto, Hamilton, St. Catharines, London, Chatham, Buxton, Windsor, and Colchester.
And my story is primarily about the Reverend Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was a Congregationalist minister. He bought a first-class ticket to England on the Cunard liner Europa in April 1853. He recounted what had happened in his speech that he gave at Exeter Hall in London a month later. His ticket was honored, but he was told again he had to dine alone in his stateroom. According to the autobiography he wrote later, he actually spoke to Edward Cunard, who was Samuel Cunard's son, managing the New York office, about the ticket. He was informed that in order to avoid Americans complaining and their ship being what they called the arena of constant quarrels on the subject, they had to make a rule that colored passengers shall eat in their staterooms or they can't take them aboard. When this happened to Ward, he knew that this circumstance was relatively mild. Previously, he had noted that discrimination while traveling happened at least half the time, and his own family experience showed that race-hatred-based separation was not unexpected. 2 years earlier, in fact, in November of 1851, his wife Emily and his son and daughters were traveling on the Lake Ontario steamer Admiral from Rochester, New York to Toronto, when they were ordered from the stateroom for which they had purchased the ticket and forced to spend the night huddled on the deck. Fortunately, it was not raining. Of his own trip to England in 1853, Ward said of his exclusion from first-class facilities, Mr. Cunard's reason was that the Southerners otherwise might make a difficulty. Yet Ward was a British subject and Mr. Cunard was an Englishman. If Englishmen then had not something to do with slavery, he did not know who had. This prejudice against the Negro ought to be rooted out, and the colored man, if worthy of it, ought to be allowed to occupy a position in society on equal terms with his white brethren, which reminds me of the story Judy told us this morning. Ward's comment led to cheers from his audience. In actual fact, in creating an alternative to official policy, on that trip on the Europa, Ward accepted the invitation of the second-class steward and ate with the second-class passengers. At a time in Britain when everyone was reading Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Reverend Ward was a very popular speaker. And he was also raising money for Canadian blacks. After all, he was now one himself. A few years earlier, in association with Unitarian minister Samuel J. May and others in Syracuse, New York, Ward was involved with the rescue of a fugitive slave who had been arrested under the new Fugitive Slave Act at that time, and he had to flee to Canada himself. There he began work for the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada, and for a few years he made speeches raising money for them. In the winter of 1853, he conducted a 6-week tour through what was then southwestern Canada for the Society, showcasing the great progress being made by people finally living in liberty.
Okay, I just need to find my place here. Okay. Now, the last person that we'll talk about this morning is Sarah Parker Remond. And she became well known because she had a winning lawsuit contesting refusal to honor her ticket to the opera in Boston. And in refusing to honor the ticket, they ejected her from the building, of course, and then she sued. She was freeborn, as were her parents. They had never been slaves and were prosperous because of their hairdressing and wig business in Salem. Desegregated education there was impossible to obtain. Like her brother Charles Lennox Remond a decade before, Sarah became known as a black abolitionist speaker. And most of the speakers, women speakers at that time on that issue, had never been slaves. In December 1858, Sarah Parker Remond left for Liverpool on the Arabia, accompanied by abolitionist Unitarian minister of Syracuse, New York, the Reverend Samuel J. May, and the reformer Reverend William Henry Channing of Boston. Both ministers were early influences and supporters of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as abolitionists and then as women's rights activists. Channing had been minister of Renshaw Street Chapel in Liverpool, but was now the minister at Hope Street Unitarian Chapel in that city. In 1859, therefore, Sarah Remond Parker attracted many crowds as she spoke about U.S. slavery and Northern discrimination. Audiences packed halls for her, and she received attention because she was very, quote, feminine, unquote. I think what that means is that she was very cultured. She had received a very good education, and she had continued her education by going to lectures and going to performances and reading a lot. So she was considered just a wonderful, calm speaker about a very tough subject, but she was very mild-spoken about it and very frank. So I think that's what caused this wonderful reception. British Unitarian minister John Relly Beard led an anti-slavery protest meeting at his chapel in Manchester when she faced racial prejudice from the American ambassador. In July 1860, the Inquirer newspaper also featured 2 stories about what happened to her as she returned to the United States. One was headlined, "Colored Passengers and the Cunard Ships." The other was, "The Prejudice of Color." Again, it happened. When she purchased a first-class ticket, she was forbidden to eat with the other passengers. A scholar writes, a local Bristol official complained to Sir Samuel Cunard that since Great Britain recognized no distinction of rights because of color, captains of his ships ought not be permitted to make his vessels the scenes of social oppression. The Inquirer newspaper, in addition, was concerned that British businesses' commerce might disintegrate, degenerate to the standard of American slaveholding community, a monstrous absurdity. It was a duty to their own high standard of civilization and social equality not to lower it to the American platform. Raymond was so well treated in England that she returned. She took classes at Bedford College, founded by prominent women Unitarians like Barbara Lee Smith Bodicon from 1859 to 1861. So she took 2 years of courses at the only institute for higher learning in Britain for women. She was able to teach white students as a result, as she would not have been allowed in the United States. Then Raymond passed a nursing course. When she finally moved to Italy after the U.S. Civil War, she gained a physician's degree and practiced medicine there for 2 decades. Frederick Douglass visited her in Florence because he was going to the tomb of Theodore Parker, which was the Boston abolitionist minister who had died in Italy. And I think the biographers of Frederick Douglass lowball how radical he was religiously. In conclusion, between 1845 and 1865, there were over a dozen incidents of discrimination against blacks on the Cunard Line. Boston's newspaper, The Liberator, made much of these occurrences, but this story does have a happy ending. In 1865, after the U.S. Civil War had ended, a black minister, several black ministers I have found, traveling on Cunarders were able to eat with the other passengers. They were able to converse with other passengers on deck, and even to share pictures of their grandchildren with great satisfaction. Okay, now, I have to remember this.
Community is made possible by the offering of our individual skills, commitments, and gifts. The truth is, though, that we need each other and money to survive. And yet, nobody's worth and dignity is in any way measured by the amount of money that they have or don't have. So, during the offering, we invite you to offer what you can, if you can, to support this sanctuary of progressive spirituality. And any undesignated money in our bowls today will go to the operation of our wonderful community. If you don't carry cash, no problem. You can donate easy peasy by doing an e-transfer to treasurer@uuch.ca. Our closing hymn today, as we've been talking about transatlantic voyages, is Sailing by Rod Stewart, and the after choir and the pickup choir who performed this at the library at the interfaith gathering are going to perform this again. I'm so happy.
Doesn't matter. I don't want to be too close.
We'll split up.
Who's clapping for us? So you may have lyrics. If you do, then please sing along with us. And with Tristan on the keyboard.
Our chalice extinguishing words are in the order of service, if you want to read them. They're written by Carl Seberg. Through our temporary lives, the great currents of history run. Let us keep the channels open and free, so as not to obstruct purposes greater than our own. Let us keep our minds set upon the high goals that here bind us into one sharing fellowship of loving hearts. I knew one of those chords was going to get me someday. Don't forget that there is hot chocolate, and I don't know if it's in the kitchen. Might be. Is it in the kitchen? It's going to be out in the bowl.